Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Dawn, for that introduction. Melanie, it's wonderful to have the chance to speak again. And at the end of the day, to draw together some of the thoughts from what I think has been a wonderful conversation. And it's covered our creative ambitions in this country. It's covered the speed and growth of network investment. It's covered the AI revolution, that revolution that might be bigger than energy or fire, but we still have a long, long way to go. And of course, safety at the core of all of this. And the playing field is key to all of those successes. And you very effectively are the overseer, enabler of that playing field. Now with that, one of the great priorities for the UK government at the moment is stimulating economic growth. And please take the context I just gave. And as part of that new approach to regulation, it's challenged regulators, all regulators, to ensure that you use your role to drive that growth. So what is your approach to that growth for the industries that you regulate?
Well, look, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to finish up. And there's been so much today to mull over. And can I just say thank you to Deloitte and Enders and all the partners for once again bringing us all together, just really on behalf of all of us. It's amazing. So look, I passionately believe, we all believe at Ofcom, that economic growth and regulation can go hand in hand. And indeed, sometimes you need regulation to help markets work better so that productivity can be properly built on a level playing field where people aren't looking over their shoulders, worrying about safety standards being eroded by their competitor. And I think if you think about the markets in our sectors, what's been, I think, brilliant for us as the regulator is how much change and innovation, particularly from technology, has been happening over the last, 4 or 5 decades, not just in the last 4 or 5 years. And what that's meant is, if you think back to the mid-'80s when BT had just been privatised, privatised, because sometimes things go in the opposite direction, you just have to get the word right. But what you had then was, if you were an ordinary consumer, you could make a landline phone call or you could send a letter, but those were pretty much the only ways that you could communicate. Yeah. And you think now, you've got multiple networks over which connectivity can happen, fixed, mobile, satellite, cable, you've got multiple different, apps and systems over which that can happen, audio, video. We would never have dreamt of that in the mid-'80s. And that innovation and competition driven by technology has enabled Ofcom to only intervene where we need to, and actually to reduce our regulation over the years, and to be able to think quite carefully and judiciously about where we need to intervene, but also where we don't. So I could speak at huge length on all of this, but we do passionately believe ultimately that if you're forward-thinking, if our regulation is technology neutral and you're not regulating the tech, you're regulating the service or the market, then actually there is huge opportunity from getting regulation right.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there any specific dive into the creative industries that you'd highlight there?
Yeah, well, I think, again, people often talk about regulation in general terms, but it's often achieving slightly different things. So fixed telecoms, we were hearing earlier, Ofcom's regulation is there because the market would otherwise, not be a level playing field. There would be significant market power in the hands of Openreach. But when we're thinking about broadcasting, yes, we're maintaining standards for broadcast TV and radio. And again, we were just hearing that plays a part. That standards regulation plays a part in trust. Yeah. But what we're also doing, and have been doing again for decades, is working with an industry where, again, in the 80s and before, you had only a few players that were bringing us entertainment on news. We had linear TV, we had BBC Radio, and what that meant was that those commercial balance sheets, ITV and then Channel 4 and Channel 5, actually had quite a lot of capacity to deliver public service outcomes. And so the regulation, the allocation of spectrum and licenses, and the prominence that gave, that was in exchange for some things which the government and Parliament, and then via Ofcom and its predecessors, was requiring of those industries. So that's regulation to create public goods, if you like. It's a very different model from the one we're doing on fixed telecoms. And the question there is, what can we still afford from industries where there's now so much choice for the consumer that actually they haven't got the capacity to put on things which we may all want to have, but they may not be as affordable for us as a country as they once were.
Okay, and we're going to dive into some of that. I'm going to start with this question of trust, and we've talked quite a lot today about AI and trust, and particularly AI, trust and news. We had a couple of panels that touched on that, which you will have listened to. So what is your priority, and how are you looking at it? You've highlighted it in the 3-year plan, but you need to ensure audiences have access to a plurality of news sources, and you've said this, that they really can trust and that are accurate and impartial. So how are you managing that, and how are you thinking about that piece of the playing field?
Well, this is, it's a really big and challenging set of questions, as anyone who's here, who's actually running news organisations knows better than I do. Again, so much of what's happened in the last 20, 25 years has been amazing in terms of the new players coming into the market, but the audience attention is increasingly fragmented and spread across multiple different channels. And this year, for the first time, we saw the percentage of adults who get their news from TV and radio slipping below social media. Just a bit, but they were, it's now below. So more people getting their news from social media and other online sources. And what that means is that, again, we have to think about what we've taken for granted for many years, which is that if you make high-quality public service and other news provider sources available to the public, then that'll do the job. And it's no longer the case. We've really got to think about what prominence means in the modern world, about platforms like YouTube and social media as well, and how we get great content that's accurate and impartial where necessary to the public. But we've also got to think about what the public enjoys. And people increasingly do quite like opinion with their news, for example. So we're thinking about this right now. Our public service media review towards the end of the summer, just before the parliamentary recess, will open up these issues again, put some of the potential solutions on the table. And it was great to hear the Secretary of State this morning saying that the government will be doing their own review on the back of that to take some of that forward.
Excellent. Okay, very helpful to hear. I'm going to shift to connectivity, because one of the great assets, I believe, you have as a regulator is that ability to regulate across these multiple industries, in a sense, and bring them together. You've achieved significant success, I would say, in driving fixed and mobile 4G, 5G level connectivity, starting that journey. But as Natalie said earlier, we're at 74% fibre penetration. We're at over 92% 4G penetration now and growing. The next frontier is going to be satellite connectivity. I wondered if you could just comment on, firstly, that success and the playing field that you've enabled, and we've had some really rich discussion with the different players today, as you will have heard, I hope, but also how you're creating the next playing field to enable that next frontier of growth, development, investment that I talked a bit about with Margarita in satellite, but elsewhere in the industry as well, in a significant transition.
Yeah, well, fibre rollout is a good example of where, as a regulator, some years ago now, Ofcom decided to be, more ambitious than anyone thought we should be at the time, I think, in going for competition as the key enabler for investment over this current investment cycle of fibre rollout. And we took a punt, really, that was going to come, that investors would back it, and that we would get the delivery. And we've been really pleased by what's happened over the last few years, and we expect the market to change and develop over the next 5 years. But fundamentally, we've seen the affordable, increasingly widespread fibre connections that we know the country needs. I think the job that's now needed is to finish and reach into areas where it's not commercial, as well as for that commercial build to continue underpinned by regulation. There's obviously a huge role the government plays there, the governments across the UK actually, but also ultimately to drive take-up. You can't really move a country onto digital services in pan-UK services like the NHS unless pretty much everybody is using the best connectivity in their home. You can't think about things like DTT switch off and what the future of TV distribution might be without thinking about what people will have in their homes as an alternative. So that's a really complex question. We can play a role in Ofcom, but the industry, the government, other partners are going to be critical in that. And I think I would say generally that we look at Ofcom at the challenges ahead And there are very few silver bullets around. There are very few areas where we can go, that's the thing that everybody needs to focus on and that will do the job. It's going to involve partnership. It's going to involve multiple levers. It's going to involve a relentless focus on vulnerable customers, cybersecurity along the way, or we will lose the public through this next phase.
So really you're focused on that interconnection of fixed, mobile, satellite connectivity in terms of driving this platform and a level of connectivity that enables the rest of our economy.
Yeah, and I think
and
to answer your question properly on mobile and satellite, I think our role as a regulator on mobile our main role is to make sure that spectrum is available. Yeah. And with the completion of the Vodafone 3 merger in the last few days, I congratulate both companies for the work that they've put in to get over the line. We have quite an exciting period, I think, ahead of more investment, but also, at Ofcom, we're now going to be able to follow through by making some spectrum available for millimetre wave, which will help in more congested areas like, train stations, football stadia, and so on. We have other plans for auctions later this year. So there's a lot that we do to underpin that investment in that industry, but we don't regulate it in the same way as for fixed connections. I think satellite is really exciting. Obviously Starlink has already made big inroads, but we have Amazon coming up alongside. We have Vodafone's pilots in Wales. Ofcom has facilitated that by making spectrum licenses available, working with international counterparts to think about how that works globally, and it's surely an area of growth, and for some parts of the country it will be the best bet for connectivity into the future.
And hopefully a piece, because I've been very positive about the extent of connectivity across the country and the speed of rollout. We had good discussion on it earlier. But we still have a lot of persistent gaps, and we have a lot of gaps on our transport infrastructure, but also in various areas, both urban and rural, and certainly in 5G in terms of unlocking the potential that you talk about. So what levers do Ofcom and the government really have to help us address those gaps, and particularly that gap in transport infrastructure, where the interconnect of network rail, government, cost of ensuring the connectivity, all of that needs to come together to deliver a very different experience.
Yeah, well, look, on mobile, I answer about 8 letters each week from members of Parliament who've presented me with constituents' concerns, and I would say about half of them are on mobile coverage, and another quarter is probably on broadband, and which is just interesting what people write to us about. And on mobile, I think there's a number of jobs still to do. Clearly, there are parts of the country where it's still about not spots, not as many as there were. There's been good progress on that in the last few years. Most parts of the country can now get good, reliable, signal to make a phone call, and certainly to contact the emergency services and roam onto networks to do that. But as we all get more hungry for data, and of course with AI that's just going to grow and grow, it's got to be about not just coverage of 4G, it's got to be about that being reliable, strong enough signal at multiple times of day. And so what we're going to be doing in a few weeks' time actually is updating our mobile checker to actually give more information at that higher standard than the one that is currently there, so people can see not just what they need to make a phone call and what they'll be able to get in their local area, but also what they might need to do something that's a bit more what we need in our daily lives. And it's going to be a trial and a new product. We want all the engagement of what it's actually like on the ground, because we all know that actually the experience on the ground can be quite different from what's predicted by the MNOs as well. So that's another part of the story.
So that's to drive transparency, encouraging action, and helping the investors understand where they need to play. And
exactly, and helping consumers understand what they're likely to be able to get. It'll never be a perfect prediction, and you'll be able to see it by the 4, or shortly to be 3 MNOs, so you'll be able to compare and contrast.
Excellent. We're looking forward to that.
Continue.
Thank you. We're looking forward to that. So with the backdrop of the focus on growth and the simplification of regulation, we've also had the very important passing of the Online Safety Act, which I know has been an absolutely linchpin piece of legislation from your point of view. And by Ofcom's reckoning, it brings an additional 100,000 plus services into new obligations, and it imposes regulatory requirements. So recognising the concerns around online safety, the hugely legitimate, I will say, concerns, and the prevention of harms to children, but to many others in society as well, how will you measure success and the positive impact from the Online Safety Act?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge new mission for Ofcom, and the Act went live 18 months ago, or 21 months ago, and our codes now are concluded. We've done a huge amount of heavy lifting on the policy front that concluded at the end of April, mostly. We've got a final consultation, which will be, final consultations on that, on the core pillars of the codes are there. Yep. So we're now into enforcement. We've already opened a number of enforcement investigations against some smaller platforms we believe to be high risk, including a pro-suicide forum, a Nudify app, a couple of porn sites that are particularly risky. And you'll see more from us on that in the coming weeks and months. How do we measure success? It's tough because the industry hasn't measured safety. It's tended to measure things like the prevalence of illegal content, so 0.00% of content maybe being about suicide and self-harm, for example, but that's not the metric we're interested in. We're interested in what happens if you're a teenager and whether or not you get that stuff on your feed. You shouldn't be getting it now under the Online Safety Act. There's a different measure of success. So that's what we're going to be asking the industry to give us the evidence on. That's what we're going to be holding them to account on. There are some functionalities like age assurance at aged 18, which we're driving very hard through the porn industry and also through any platform that has teenagers using it regularly. They're going to have to offer a different service to teenagers compared to adults. They're going to need highly effective age assurance to ensure that. So there are some things you can measure. You can see whether that is or is not in place. But that broader question of safety, it's a tough one. But we're absolutely focused on that. And I mean, we feel very, very, very accountable on this one. Every time I do any media on it, there's a sense of the public at the end of the TV screen, just willing us on, but also holding us to account for making a difference.
Yeah, so I do have a follow-on question on this. You're applying more of what I would call the morality of the physical world to the digital world, in a sense. And there's a huge support for that, and I think there's huge expectation that comes with it for yourselves. But how are you seeing other countries reacting to what we are doing? Because I think it's safe to say that the UK is ahead of the rest of the world in this. There are many geographies which share equally deep concerns, but in terms of regulating, we're moving a little quicker than most. And I just wondered if you could comment on how you're seeing that and what you're hearing.
Yeah, so I think I'd give other countries a little bit more what I would see as credit than that, because I'm in favour of regulation in this area. So Australia's been at this game longer than us, actually, and they're just strengthening their laws. And the European Union passed the Digital Services Act a year earlier than our Parliament, and that's a close cousin of the Online Safety Act, but it's different in a number of areas, and doesn't have the independent regulatory oversight of Ofcom. It's politically led by the Commission, so it's a different beast. And I think it will be very complementary. We've set up a global network for online safety regulators. We're chairing that from Ofcom at the moment, so that we can, share our intel, share our technical expertise on things like what good age assurance looks like, what good content moderation looks like, so that we can join up in a way that means we can get out of the hair of industries and not have 30 different systems where that's not necessary, but also, frankly, where we see common risks, which we do, that we can act together on them. So that global cooperation is going to be important here. It's a good connection. And some of the US states are actually taking forward action in this area as well. So. Although I don't think the federal government probably will anytime that soon.
Not at the moment, no.
They may, actually, but not right now, perhaps.
The other landmark piece of legislation has been the Media Act. So big changes for PSB, big changes for the responsibilities of streaming services. And I wondered if you could talk about what impact you anticipate the Media Act will have and why it's necessary.
Yeah, well, this came out of, it's the first media broadcasting legislation for several decades and recognised, that actually the framework had become out of date, partly for some of the reasons I was describing earlier. We had regulation that reflected a world of the 1990s where we still had relatively few players, where choice for consumers was still quite narrow. We were just beginning to see, US box sets coming onto telly. I mean, that just seems a million years ago from where we are today. So there's a huge update needed, and in particular, I think that one of the most important things, and I think those in the industry would say this, is updating the prominence regime, so that it's not just about linear TV, it's actually about prominence on digital platforms as well. And so that and many other things we're taking forward now in our implementation, but it is quite a big piece of work. And of course, it flows from our last review of public service media. We made the recommendations to the government. They took them forward in the Media Act with a number of changes and additions. And so we're opening up that policy question again this summer of what more needs to be done, while also implementing the changes that we think will help, but they're not going to be, the last word here.
And so, Melanie, just as a concluding question, really, and your comment, what are your big challenges for the year ahead, and how do you see them playing out?
Well, I think across our remit, I think I would say it's about really thinking about what the job is going to be like in 3 or 5 years' time. Yeah. And we haven't talked very much about AI, but clearly it's going to transform the services that consumers rely on in many ways. Some of them absolutely fantastic. It's going to make things cheaper. It's going to make things more efficient. It's going to improve, management of networks, spectrum management. It actually offers huge creative opportunities for broadcasting, but it brings evident risks as well. You're already seeing that clearly in online services. You're seeing, intimate image abuse, I'm afraid child sexual abuse material and so on. It's so much easier to create and promulgate with new technologies. So that balance of risk and opportunity for us as a regulator is absolutely huge. And being on top of that and working out what we need to do and where actually the market will be the best way to decide what should happen to benefit consumers.
Thank you. So, Dame Melanie, a huge thank you for that quick tour d'horizon across what is happening in regulation in this country.
Really, wasn't it?
It was, but also to you and your team for all the work you do to make sure that this is a fair and balanced playing field from which the organisations that populate the room here can grow. So, a huge thank you to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.